So this is a piece of work which I'd like to describe as a multi-ordinal movie. It's been made especially for the conference. And so to respond to this year's theme, I've appropriated a popular motif from philosophy, that of Plato's cave. The title pun is intended, it's spelt differently to avoid nasty copyright issues. And it's hopefully easier to appreciate with an American or possibly even a New York accent. I hope, because maybe you say Play-Doh, whereas we might say Plato. The title suggests employing the situation of the cave as used in Plato and playing with it, seeing the idea as a malleable substance, and the cave is used as a springboard for ideas, to generate ideas. It's interesting to note that the etymology of the word cave comes from the Latin cavus, meaning hollow. So I kind of see this piece of work as an attempt to carve out a niche. Okay, so essentially we see Plato's cave as a cautionary tale regarding the education of the philosopher and how the philosopher is to be willing to learn, unlearn and relearn. Referred to as the simile of the cave and not the metaphor, suggesting that the process of learning can be like some kind of tough emancipation. I think there's the notion of educational violence which comes up in classical Greek philosophy. Okay, so just a quick sketch of the situation of the cave, just to refresh our memories. Plato's cave tells the tale of a group of prisoners chained up in a cave for all their lives, unable to move their hands, literally a captive audience, so a little bit like a conference setting, really. They see nothing but a series of shadows cast on the wall in front of them, and these objects are paraded by puppeteers across a platform behind the prisoners. The voices of the puppeteers can be heard by the captives, who assume that all sound comes from the images on the wall. One day a captive is forcibly removed from the cave, and the rest of the simile tells the tale of the captive's relearning and his return to the cave to share his findings with fellow prisoners. Philosophical conclusions are drawn about the nature of learning and the societal obligations of the learned or the philosopher as pertains to the ingredients needed for a good and just society. The fact that the prisoners are educated by shadows only to ascend to the world... Oh, that's strange. What's happened there? I can see it on my screen. I can't... Oh, right, there we go. Sorry, have you been missing some of this? Oh, right, okay, you haven't missed much, don't worry. Okay. Am I good to...
Yeah, we're trying to get the lights down in the room so the...
Oh, right, okay. Yeah, that's a good idea. Yeah, that's nice. Oh, there we go. Descending into the cave. Okay. So the fact that the prisoners are educated by shadows only to ascend to a world of objects illuminated by the sun suggests an analogy of two-dimensionality, or at least the flatness of words, even multi-ordinal terms, as opposed to the reality labelled by them. It's kind of like I see it as words are possibly the shadows of things. There's also the notion of inference. According to Devitt and Sterelny in Language and Reality, inference is central both to language and thought. Excuse me. A consideration of inference provides further support for truth. Inference is a practice we engage in all of the time, often without being aware of it. We frequently could not exploit our observational knowledge without it. So inference plays a part as a kind of middle ground or connecting principle between language and reality. Our prisoner infers that any noise he hears comes from the shadows in front of him. He infers that this is reality. Hence, when he's led into the sunlight out of the cave, he finds it a painful process. So we see why the simile is rich in epistemological considerations and language problems. So it's a very alluring idea that it's suggested that when thinking about the analogy of the cave, we replace it with the cave apparatus with the idea of cinema. And so we can understand Plato's cave, as Steven Pinker does, as a kind of cinema for the Flintstones. To look at the simile in this way opens up further potentials for our thinking. Nathan Anderson approached the simile in this manner at depth in his book Shadow Philosophy. He illustrates that the prisoner mistakes appearance for reality and builds inferences from these phenomena. The cinema goer, however, knows that the things portrayed on the screen are not real. The prisoner is not privy to suspension of disbelief. He has had no other reality. The cinema goer, however, can be mentally absorbed in a kind of union between mind and moving image. So the first moviegoers were actually believed the images were real and famously fled from images of an oncoming train. So it took time for us to incorporate this voodoo within our cognitive devices and become aware of it as an abstraction from reality. The fact remains that cinematic images are simultaneously affirmed as real whilst generated by an apparatus of disavowal. In other words, what happens on the screen is and is not at the same time, and this symbiosis allows the observer to believe in the reality of what is projected, whilst at the same time knowing that it is a simulacrum. If we're aware of this symbiosis, we find ourselves in accordance with Korzybski's concern of the false to fact character of language. He says, say whatever you choose about the object, and whatever you might say it is not it. In other words, whatever you might say the object is, it is not. So we find an examination of this mingling of presence with absence, often backed up by support from psychoanalytic theory, in the work of many theorists about film. For example, one of the most prominent theorists in this film was Christian Metz, whose body of work began with a semiotic analysis of the conditions of film. Through works such as Language and Cinema and Film Language, a semiotics of the cinema, Metz developed ideas about the epistemic qualities of cinematic experience, both from within the film, in its makeup and narrative, and from the point of view of the spectator, suggesting that cinema creates an all too powerful identification with what passes on the screen, whilst employing Lacan's theory of the subject of the gaze, where illusion is always perceived as illusion. In the cinematic apparatus as social institution, Metz explains, the film is not exhibitionist. I watch it, but it doesn't watch me watching it. Nevertheless, it knows that I am watching it, but it does not want to know. This fundamental disavowal is what has guided the whole of classical cinema into paths of story, relentlessly erasing its discursive basis and making it, at best, a beautiful closed object. Here, a certain consciousness of abstraction could be cultivated around the idea of cinema viewing in order to create more integrated experience, not so divested from reality. The will to experience the cinema is mainly a will to escapism and enjoyment, but this was criticised as not being socially orientated enough. The cinema experience has been expressed as a modern striving for privacy and solitude by Stanley Cavell, but a more active facility for the cinema, its ability to do philosophy, to create a language, to replicate and enhance mental processes as a kind of cognitive prosthetic, were characteristics of the medium that interested theorists like Bazin and Deleuze. The language that cinema created could possibly extend thought. prisoners in our cave, named as prisoners by Plato, create an image of almost another worldly entity. In this sense, their otherness leads me to the etymology of the word alien, from the Latin alienus, meaning belonging to the other. And this linguistic chain provokes these peculiar creatures to emerge in the piece. So, we could not conduct an investigation into Plato's cave without reference to Heidegger's essay, The Essence of Truth. Heidegger's text includes a close analysis of etymology and roots of words used by Plato. Uncovering the true meaning of the word truth as unhiddenness, he writes, "The prisoners know the distinction between hiddenness and unhiddenness as such, just as little as they know the distinction between shadows and things that cast shadows, or the distinction between light and dark. This absence of distinction makes the cave dwellers, as we say, utterly removed." So we see that within their condition there's a certain truth or light shed upon the situation. The journey to unhiddenness is a journey by degrees, not simply the dichotomy of being either inside the cave or outside the cave. There's a degree of unhiddenness in the shadows themselves, and in the release from the shackles. It's as if unhiddenness permeates everything, but in different units, akin to kind of levels of abstraction. So as mentioned, the prisoners do not register the shadows as being coefficient with objects. They do not have the word shadow with which to label the phenomena. But shadows themselves have a very interesting philosophical status. In his book Seeing Dark Things, Roy Sorensen states, "Shadows are non-material, three-dimensional holes in the light, rather than merely dark spots on surfaces. Shadows themselves have surfaces. They can be absolutely hollowed out." So we find that actually a shadow can have three dimensions if measured from the surface of the light-blocking object to the surface of the silhouette that the silhouette rests upon. Its empirical status is far more exciting than that of just a flat projection. And what's more, shadows can be hollowed out. And what better place for this to be seen than in a cave, in a hollow? Junichiro Tanizaki, writing about alcoves, which can be seen as a kind of domesticated pseudo-cave, states the mysterious Orient, of which Westerners speak, probably refers to the uncanny silence of these dark places, and even as we children would feel an inexpressible chill as we peered into the depths of an alcove which the sunlight had never penetrated. Interesting here to note the alcove as a place where the sun does not penetrate. This is exactly the situation of the cave, where it is a world illuminated by the sun that is a greater reality. The sun is seen as the source of the purest forms, and yet we're unable to look at it. So to help our prisoner climb out of the cave, perhaps it would help him in his evaluations if we employed Hayakawa's abstraction ladder. If we were to use this method, then the shadow would be perceived not as the word shadow. The word shadow is the name given to the object of perception, and the name is not the object. The word shadow stands for characteristics attributed as common to all shadows, and he would also not confuse levels of abstraction and would acquire a powerful tool in the evaluation of reality. He would delay his responses. Hayakawa uses an example of attributing yellowness to a pencil. He says, "We talk about yellowness of a pencil as if the yellowness were a property of the pencil and not a product. As we have seen, of the interaction of something outside our skins with our nervous systems. He goes on to explain, properly speaking, we should not say the pencil is yellow, which is a statement that places the yellowness in the pencil. We should say instead, that which has an effect upon me leads me to say pencil also has an effect on me which leads me to say yellow. We don't have to be that precise, of course, in language of everyday life, he continues to say, but it should be observed that the latter statement takes into consideration the part of our nervous systems play in creating whatever pictures of reality we may have in our heads, while the former statement does not. So we find if our prisoner uses the abstraction ladder to leave the cave mentality, he's better equipped to delay reactions and to incorporate reality at a distance through the act of awareness of a language as a tool. So, to end this playful excursion with an exercise, I want to chart, document and play with a dialectical conflict between language and reality. To do this, I try and paint from a series of verbalised and written instructions. And if, as Benjamin Lee Whorf asserts, the world is presented in a kaleidoscopic flux of impressions which has to be organised by our minds, and this means largely by linguistic systems in our minds, if this is the case, then I should have no problem in organising ideas into a coherent chain in order to depart from point A to point B. As soon as this exercise is started, though, there appears a stark contrast between that which is externalised and that which is internalised. So a confused mechanism of feedback emerges, and orders of abstraction are confused. I write the sentence, paint the background red. I externalise, I follow the demand. I mix paint directly from a red tube, but the red that I instinctively grab is actually a hue of the family of redness called vermilion. Vermilion, the etymology of that term is from vermis, meaning worm, because originally the hue was developed from a dye which came from the insect. So I decide not to change the word in the command and to use the colour chosen, and I also thwart the desire to cover the canvas in worms. The background is covered, so the next instruction is written, draw chalk lines. Chalk lines of what, where, what colour? I just make a few token marks. I'm already becoming stifled by this exercise. It feels as if I'm pinned down. Gestures seem stultified. I'm deprived of the sense of thinking through matter. In the book Teaching as Subversive Activity, Postman and Weingartner say we're imprisoned in the house of language. We try to assess what is outside the house from our position within it. And here I begin to empathise with this statement. The language commands fall short of reality. Wait, wait, wait. So, here I begin to empathise with this statement. The language commands fall short of the reality of the flurry of ideas, thinking in images and the tacit engagement with substance. I'm not trying to assess painting itself through the exercise. I'm trying to assess the efficacy of language in the painting of reality. and I find that painting soon dominates. The immediacy of the visual language and the manipulation of matter, for me, seems far more efficacious in its ability to encompass change and therefore closer to the structure of reality. A bit like Plato's prisoner, I'm unaware of the world of possibility due to limiting my experience. Also, the exercise notes the inescapable circularity of processes, and here we find a kinship with the structure of knowledge. As Korzybski writes, there are certain activities which we reinstate and verify through the very fact of attempting to assume that these forms of activity do not exist or that these laws are not valid. So the painterly act supports the written commands, but then it usurps them. The creative flow seems to bulldoze language, but at the same time, the marks are left through provocation by language command. So we're reminded here again of our situation in the cinema, where we found that illusion affirmed itself and negated itself at the same time. We're also reminded of Camus' analysis in Art and Rebellion, where he writes, art is an activity that exalts and denies simultaneously. And then further on he says, hostility to art by revolutionary reformers must be pointed out. Plato is moderately reasonable. He calls in question the deceptive function of language and exiles the poets from his republic. Okay, so just to recap on our findings, we followed a trajectory that took us from Plato into the realms of cinema, where we noted that cinema brought us into an encounter with language of affirmation and negation. Exploring Heidegger's rigorous analysis, grounded in etymological study, we discovered the distinction between hiddenness and unhiddenness. We played with the concept of shadow as analogous to the gulf between words and things. We employed Hayakawa's abstraction ladder to ascend from the cave to consciousness of abstraction. We noted a sense of entanglement and stultification when performing actions as a result of verbal commands, which led us to experiencing the circularity of knowledge, and this, in turn, has pointed us back to the language of cinema and the duality of affirmation and denial. These findings constitute hollowings out, many of which I'd like to explore further in further investigations.